All right. Good
Yeah, you
morning,
might.
good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. I'm super excited, grateful, and honored that we are joined today, of course, not only with someone who's become a very good friend of the show and a good friend of myself, Brandon from Expanding Reality, but we're also joined by someone who I was supposed to be on a roundtable with many days ago, but unfortunately, certain things came up and I couldn't make it. But without further ado, we have with us Miss Mira Taylor, who is an integrative therapist, in addition to a mental, spiritual awareness individual, has a master certificate in it, and amongst a slew of other things as well. But for the sake of saving time in all of this, how are you doing, Mira? And thank you so very kindly for coming on today.
I'm doing wonderfully. I'm very happy to be here, very happy to have aligned with the show and the audience, and excited for more amazing conversation. I had an awesome time on the show last week with without your presence, unfortunately, but I'm sure you were with us in spirit.
Yes,
Glad
yes.
you're feeling better. But yeah, I had an amazing time talking about fractals and consciousness with Andy and Brandon. So I'm excited to see where we fractal out into this conversation.
Awesome. And Brandon, how are you doing, brother?
Every day above ground's a great day. Thank you for asking, and just pumped to be here. Of course, Mira's just one of my best friends ever, and she's just wonderful and so intellectually challenging. I want to make sure I say that right, challenging, and she's
Not
just
challenged.
a delight, right? And so I'm very excited about these two meeting of the minds. You in the audience, I know this is one that I set up, and I'm very excited. And this one goes out to the audience. This you two right there. All right.
I If
So
you're
let's
saying that, sure, then I imagine that we'll hit it off quite well. Just for the record, for the audience, about 10 minutes before we started recording, we kind of just did a quick chat of just very vaguely things that we could encompass and cover, and a lot of it had to do with, again, science, philosophy, spirituality, metaphysics, mathematics, archetypes, superstructures, things like this. But more in particular, abductions and contactee phenomenon. I was wondering, Mira, if we could get your take on abductions and contactee phenomenon pertaining to whether it's, MyLab's UFO, UAP, more of a spiritual internal experience that, seems to disseminate or project outwards when it really is not per se. Not to put words in your mouth, but what do you think of that overall?
Oh, well, we're pretty in tune then. So ever since I really got into concepts of, some of the older concepts of religion or spirituality that, were the concepts of gnosis. So my business, Moon and Room Wellness, is called Gnostic Wellness, because the concept of gnosis or enlightenment to me is, all about that inner journey that we take. And so my theory with the abduction process is that it's actually, it kind of plays into the micro macro concept that, we are both an individuation within the universe and the entire universe itself. And so that when when people have an abductee experience, it's not necessarily that they're being beamed up to a ship, but that they're kind of being taken inward to a part of their universe that's got a lot of questions for what the F is God doing in our universe? We want to study. And so for a lot of people, they're like, well, why and how would that happen? But, you look at something like CERN, where we have an obsession with the God particle. And so, I basically got to the concept of understanding that I'm sure there are other dimensional beings and other, universal entities that have the same interest as we do. And that, by finding that sort of very small apportionment of light, like what CERN's looking at, that we could have a similar experience as an abductee, that, we're the thing being studied under the microscope, or that we're the thing, being taken inward consciously to another dimension that exists inside of us that we just don't really have a conscious awareness of on a daily 3D basis. There's this really amazing TED talk by a woman named, I want to say it's Jill Taylor Bolte. And she is a woman who was a neurologist who, and like, as weird as it is, this is like one of my happy blanket TED talks that I watch like once a month. But she was a neurologist who grew up with a brother with severe schizophrenia. And so she spent most of her, like, that's why she went into neurology and all that. Long story short, she had a stroke, a really severe stroke. And she was still because of her understanding as a neurologist, she was still very aware as the stroke was happening of the states of consciousness she was in. and how different the experience was mechanically for her as the left hemisphere of her brain would shut down. So, in that context to this, she had this experience where, because she basically fell into herself, she felt the expansiveness of herself. And so, it's just sort of fascinating from the context of us thinking that we're being, taken somewhere else as just this, instead of being taken inward to ourselves to understand maybe some deep inharmonious things that are happening within our own psyche, in our own personal consciousness, or just something that occurs because there's a part of us, if we're someone, for example, who has an obsession with trying to figure out creation, that there's a part of us that then would be obsessed with trying to figure us out as creator. So that's kind of, it's sort of a little bit all over the place, because it's.
But that speaks to the micro and the macro of observation.
Yes.
Right. Now, wow. Okay. So you're riding my wave here in this regard, so, or vice versa. But does this speak, in your opinion, to anything having to do with what's called non-locality? That in quantum physics, where it's there, but it also isn't simultaneously?
So I think that what people are experiencing is their total nature, of being and non-being simultaneously, which is realistically what God's perception would be, is to both be and non-be all at once, because all that total mind knows is the fullness of total self in the present moment. So even the concept of time, right, is something that gets removed a lot of times, pun intended, for abductees, but that from a linguistic standpoint, a lot of what falls away for us when we have those sort of experiences is a lot of the spatial terminology that we have linguistically applied to time, even though time and space are supposed to be inherently separate. So, we think about, and we kind of spoke to this last time or last week on the show too, but that, we talk about how long time feels, or, how, when we describe the future, how we'll talk about it being ahead of us, but that there are some cultures who speak about and have the context of the future being behind us. Again, these are all spatial perspectives that only exist because of our 3D format of understanding and the application and definement of linguistics to that 3D understanding. But that once you remove the physical realm that we're also used to, we lose all those defining points of spatiality when it comes to the concept of non-locality. So you lose it because you lose that linguistic 3D awareness that we've all gotten so comfortable with applying to things like time. If you exist outside of time, well, you can't have spatiality anymore because we've attached so many defining, words to it, basically, would be my perspective on it.
Right. Thank you so much. Do you find it, well, first off, let me say, I take it you're familiar with the Platonic solids, the different shapes that seem to comprise the core superstructure or blueprint of what we're currently living in or experiencing: the triangle, the cube, the sphere.
Yes. So Brandon and I have talked about this too, that Platonics and Platonic solids are very Euclidean from a geometric standpoint. And so to me, they lack a dimension of emotion, I would say, is the biggest thing. That, the reason I am more fascinated by things like fractal geometry and hyperbolic geometry is that they have that sort of concept of being breathing and alive. In that emotional sense, that there's like an emotional experience you have when you look at fractal geometry, whereas when you are experiencing the more simple formats of Euclidean geometry, which of course is all we're ever taught in public education, right?
Yeah.
We learn to unlearn.
You know what it's kind of like though? It's kind of like a snapshot of the moving. So it's kind of like not the full story. It's like they take a picture of the kinetic action that really comprises everything. But like you talk about, Dave, it's really more about the journey than it is the destination. So the snapshot would be this this other form, with all the normal standard shapes, the Euclidean form, but really fractal is more of the kinetic joining of all of those things together in that also encompass time. So then therefore you have duration and change. So it seems like these platonic solids are just snapshots, and that's what they present to you. But really, if you just take those and like thumb them like a flip book, you know, they animate. And this is where you get the fractal nature. So really it's like half truth, you know? You just have
I
to
think they were
animate
like
them
the
and bring life to
stepping
them.
stone to, you have to
Right.
have some
Right.
format of a stepping stone to that deeper awareness. And so it's almost like we had to have 2D geometry
Right.
before we could experience and understand the emotiveness of 3D geometry that is more that like hyperbolic and fractal nature of things. So it'll be interesting to see what 4D geometry looks and feels like once that becomes an experience for us. I'm sure, you know, there are probably beings out there who look at even fractal geometry and they're like, oh, silly humans.
Yeah, it's like us drawing in the sand or something with a stick. Yeah.
So
Yes.
I'd love to ask you though, before we go on, Mira, your perspective on when you say that you find Euclidean geometry, forgive me, you said is non-emotional, or?
I think that it's pretty rationalist and reductionist because that was the basis of understanding that we needed at the time to create a foundation for higher states of awareness.
So
It's
you're
not to degrade it in any sense, but it's, you know,
Right.
you don't, most people, aside from the emotions that occur when you're trying to solve, you know, things of that sort of nature in mathematics,
Right.
that it's not something that, you know, it's very formulaic. It's very collective consensus. Like it's very obsessed with having the same answer for everyone and everything. Whereas I think the spaces that are more available in the context of fractal and hyperbolic is that it's you know, that even mathematics can be a far more subjective and personal experience. The guy, you know, who invented and discovered is another argument point, even within, you know, the major players of mathematics. But the guy who invented and or discovered fractal geometry, Mendelbrot, was actually seen as someone who basically was, you know, causing problems for the mathematical world because it's not necessarily that it went against Euclidean geometry. I think it built upon it, but it's, you know, to me, it's not dissimilar to the relationship that Freud and Jung have. You know, I look at Euclidean as very Freudian, and I would say that I look at something like fractal or hyperbolic geometry as more Jungian, if you could sort of create that simile between those two very, you know, different fields, but archetypally similar relationships.
When you say, Mira, non-emotional, just to pick your brain on that, if I may, do you speak of, say, for example, there's no compression and expansion, if that makes sense? With no...
Yeah, there's not like a breathing to it. I think, you know, that feels a little romanticized, right? But I think there is sort of a very humanistic, romantic, natural expression to the thought of breathing. Even from a religious standpoint, you know, the breath of life is something that is very important to most of the origins of almost all forms of spirituality. That there, you know, there are people who believe that the word Yahweh was actually invented because it was the first sound we heard was the sound of breath, the Yah and the way. That's literally what it sounds like when you breathe, if you like get quiet and listen to it. So I think that it's just missing that breath. That, you know, again, it's like it's flat. We know that it's flat, even though you give dimensionality to it from a sort of illusionary standpoint, right? Like we all know that you can draw a cube on a flat plane and create a sensatory experience or understanding of the intent for dimension, but the dimensionality is still technically lacking in that space. And so even when you work with fractals, that's kind of true too, until you know, unless you went into a totally immersive experience where like let's say you put on like the 3D immersive glasses and experience like that, I think would be a cool experience for fractal geometry, because then you could see the tangibility of the true 3D depth of it. Even when you look at, you know, the Mendelbrot models and stuff, it's still kind of flat feeling because we're either looking at it on a screen or on a picture or whatever it is. So I would love to see actually some experiences for people with that, with things like fractal geometry, where you can go in and I'm sure Tony Stark would love that, right? Is that whole concept of like the projection that's more movable and truly 3D in front of you.
Sorry, what were the set of models you referenced there?
So the Mandelbrot models, so he was the first person to use a computer algorithm to generate them also,
Wow.
which is pretty fascinating.
Okay.
And a fascinating convergence for me is that I actually, my family knew a guy, an artist named Siri, who was the first person to do graphic design on a computer back in the late 80s. He did something called The Fly. It was a computer generated model, but they came around at the same time, which is sort of fascinating because The Fly is still the thing that they study the most to understand epigenetics too. So there's like a weird correlation for me as far as how those things connect to each other also, even though they express themselves so differently.
Okay, wow. Well, first off, thank you so much for bringing all of this up. I actually have a little bit of a list I wanted to go through with you here.
Yeah.
So speaking of which, I just did this a handful of days ago, speaking of synchronicities pertaining to my notes here. I'm going to show in a second, but for the audience, the first drawing is hyperbolic geometry. The second one is Euclidean, and the third one is elliptic. I'm wondering, Mira, if this would be a good visualization of what.
Yes. Okay. So yes, because I think, so we'll talk about synchronicity as far as that whole concept of spatiality and time, because synchronicity is a completely non-linear, non-chronological experience to have. It's like for me, I am very intentional. One of the affirmations I use every day is that I am living and existing on the concept of time that would be synchronistic, or as the Greeks called it, kairos time, or opportune time.
Okay.
Which is, basically existing on the time that is built around the subconscious intuitive awareness of patterns that are epicentered to you and your own personal psyche, instead of the collective consensus of what things are. So everyone can walk into a room and see a cardinal and we'll all go, okay, it's a cardinal. But to me, I've attached a subconscious integrated understanding that it is a representation of wholeness, because it also subconsciously integrates to the understanding of the cardinal directions for me, which from many different formats of spirituality and psychology represented the quaternity, or the wholeness, the addition of the feminine or subconscious fourth within a spiritual context that was sort of devoid from a lot of biblical scriptures.
Does this speak to the postulation of I am, therefore I think, rather than the other way around?
Ooh, I think that's an excellent Zen cone. Do you know what Zen cones are?
Honestly, no, but it sounds super intriguing, so I'd love to hear.
Koans are Buddhist riddles that Buddhist monks use to, they're almost always a paradox of some kind, and it's used to sort of pry open the mind of the individual, the student or the disciple, if you will, to the potential, that fullness, that potentiality in all directions that exists, that there's no right answer to it. So in that context, that we want to choose one as one or the other happening first, or becoming before the other. And for me, it's gotten to a place of simultaneity, that they happened. We don't necessarily have to make a choice point, that our duality mindset is obsessed with making a choice point about those things, but that there's also a total possibility that things happened much more simultaneously and less chronologically than we want to, as far as how creation started even.
That speaks to, in my opinion, omnipresence, not just I guess you could say quaternion presence, but omnipresence. And not only that, to me as well, that wow, okay, that speaks to, again, a scalar waves, because they're rotating in spinor states that only have magnitude, no particular direction. They are everywhere and nowhere simultaneously in that fluctuative sense. Would you agree with that, in that regard of perceiving things that in that way as well?
So yes, and even the concept, like we'll hit on the linguistics of that, because if you didn't know the words I am, or if we hadn't created language to describe the words I am, would you have a sensation of I amness? From the context of even a plant, does a plant or a tree understand the concept of I am and being, or does it see and view and experience itself in a totally different way because of that lack of linguistic understanding or belief system that we as humans seem very obsessed with? You know, a tree still is, right? But it doesn't necessarily have the context of I am, but we know that they have consciousness and that they think. That's been kind of proven scientifically. There's an amazing woman named Monica Gagliano who does a lot of work with that and is actually starting a company for sonic midwifery that has to do with plant consciousness being shared with human beings. But that whole thing of I think, therefore I am, I think that you know, there's a possibility that those things had to emerge together. That they didn't necessarily emerge one or the other.
The duality was needed in order for there to be a focal point of comparison to the other.
Right.
What if it's the paradox of the question itself? Because if you think, therefore you are, then the reason that you feel that you are is because you think. So
well, and by the way, you can think that you are not.
Well, that's true. That leads you to that. But if the reason that you think you am is because you think you am. And so that's the thing, right? And so I think, therefore I am. Therefore, if you don't think, therefore you're not, right? I mean, that's the inverse of it, right? If you just walk it backwards, the natural state would not to identify as self. Yeah, you're self-aware, like that you've got limbs and shit.
I think of entropy and negentropy when you go there.
See, right, because now you're talking about separating from self and becoming an I am. I am declares yourself separate from other things. This is when you start relationing your world out and relativity comes into play. And you're over there and I'm over here. And then this is where judgment comes in because you're told to judge things in preference to what you prefer. And so you get on this really deep rabbit hole with this. But the answer in that parable, I think, is if you just walk it completely backwards and you say, I am not, I am, therefore I'm not. So therefore, if you don't think at all, then you don't think that you are in anything. So I think the lesson there is not to separate from self in that way, from source in that way, by creating self.
But now, see, to both of your points, no disrespect, Brandon, I'll probably lean to more towards Mira's point here.
Would
one not need the opposing pillar to even derive a sense of some, I guess you could say, some sort of independence in that thought in which you're
yes, it seems like the thinking is the creation of duality. Like the fact that you thought about it and therefore made a judgment call in some way, even as an observer, therefore now you, like the first thing that you judge, the first thing that you think about. You know, this makes me think of why Native American cultures name their babies the first thing that they saw. You know, maybe that has some sort of significance. But it seems to be that the first thing that you come across with this idea is where you progress with it or you don't. And so therefore, you know, like I am a conspiracy theorist, you know, I'm just fill in the blank, whatever you want. I am a this, but you had to be exposed to that to associate yourself with it.
To also Professor Jisson's thick time, and then I would love for Mira to jump in as well, you need time to think of who you are. So by definition, right, and that speaks to, again, I'm not trying to say there's a trap or confinement, but that speaks to Mira's whole Euclidean has no emotion per se, because it's that
not animated.
It's not animated, right? There's that lineage of stability, when in reality, what we call instability, which I think there should be another word for it, but again, that speaks to the duality of our confined language. There should be
how we want to make one of those things good and one of those things bad.
It's the judgment. That's what I mean by judgment. Yeah.
Right.
And so therefore you separate, and then you gather things in your mind and in your world that you prefer over other things, right? Like this picture frame my wife picked out because she liked that over another picture frame. And so now we just have that one. So it's just like your life, right? And you do this with thoughts, you do this with energies, you do this with all sorts of experiences, right? And this is, again, an argument for consensus reality in my view, because it's so subjective, and especially when it gets to time, especially when it gets to your perception of yourself. And to what you said, Mira, about plants being self-aware, and we know that. Self-awareness is what they say, but that's our delineation. That's like the way that mankind thinks that something thinks about itself. And so
I think that they're like consciously sensory aware, but I don't know if they are aware of well, that's not true.
No,
I think that they kind of exist in, you know, just a different format of it. But the thing you said about children earlier is interesting, because there are psychologists who have proved that babies don't understand the concept of I am, or being an individuated thing, until they're like a little over 1 year old. That, you know, that there's no and I don't necessarily agree, or, you know, I'm not taking sides on this, but there have been psychologists who have sort of rationalized that to, because there isn't an I am state of consciousness in a baby, that it doesn't retain a individuated sense of soul self or self until it has that conscious awareness of the state of I amness. So it's just sort of fascinating.
They don't see themselves separate from their mom. I've seen those studies. That's crazy. They
don't
just
see
think that
themselves
mom is
as separate as anything. And this is one of the things that was fascinating about Jill Taylor Bolte's whole talk that she did on TED. Is she said one of the first things she noticed when she was having the stroke in the left hemisphere of her brain shut down is she fell against a wall, and she said the boundaries between my hand and the wall completely disappeared. That she could not, that there was just like consciousness, and she could no longer separate herself from anything around her until like her conscious mind would turn back on and be like, hey, yo, Jill, you're having a fucking stroke. Go call the hospital.
Damn.
But it's like fascinating that because that part of her brain shut down, and she describes it as having experienced nirvana.
Yeah.
That state of like not knowing the boundaries between yourself and any other part of creation or materia was what felt like enlightenment or nirvana to her, and not necessarily, you know, the other way around.
Because it dissolved individuation. It like mended you into the one. Now you're everything. And so it's a very comfortable, amazing feeling. Yeah.
I think babies kind of experience that. Like they don't necessarily like, you know, they also are linguistically unaware for the most part too, which is sort of fascinating what that does to the state of consciousness, even for us at a level of materia experience. But yeah, it's just sort of, it's interesting that there could even be a possibility for that sensation or awareness within consciousness because of something like a stroke, and then someone could come back and kind of speak to that. One of the other funny things about that talk is that when she came back and she realized she was having a stroke, her next thought as a neurologist was, how cool that I get to experience this.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Well,
which totally resonated with me, because I feel like I'm that kind of person too, where I'd be like, oh my God, how do I observe this? This is fascinating. Like,
that's how I'd be if I got abducted. When I get abducted and they let me remember, I'm sure I'm totally annoying to those things, because they're just like, oh God, this motherfucker again. And just asking a bunch of questions and shit.
Well, speaking of abductions, I did want to just quickly come full circle on that. Speaking on Platonic solids and Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometries, do you find in your personal research, Amira, that pertaining to abduction and or contactee phenomenon, there's a reoccurrence of the Platonic solids or Euclidean shapes or even non-Euclidean shapes?
So I think it depends on which, not to apply too much spatiality terminology to it, but which dimensional part of yourself you're being taken to. That maybe it is the more two-dimensional foundational structure that needs greater awareness or strength of understanding applied to it. And so the entities or experiences that you partake in that sense might be more two-dimensional, because maybe they're trying, maybe they have to reach out to the third dimension to be able to evolve into the third dimension. That's something that has to happen for us. And so, I think that there's even a simultaneity there, that we can lose our sense of what, even 2D format experience or understanding or mathematics is intended to be for us. But that, for me, I look at, we talked about this last time, that for me, if I think of what non-3D dimensional beings would appear to me as, or what a lot of people refer to as light beings, that they would be very light-based and very fractal looking, versus, more Euclidean looking. But that's my personal perception. I think that, a lot of the things that happen too is that spiritual or non-real entities, astral entities that we experience, appear to us in the format of things that we have a deep and resonant relationship with. So this is why, multiple cultures have a format of Christ or Buddha that appeared very different to them, because it looked the most like them, or it had the most resonance for them. And so that was the best way for that dimensional being to create a connection through consciousness to you. But that, the way I experience that being would probably be different than the way you experience that being, because it's just looking for the best way to make a sort of emotional connection to you through the things that you already kind of have a deep reverence or understanding for.
The information structures are providing you a certain comfortability that
Yes.
whether you want to call it your neurons, the external sensors are more receptive to in an electromagnetic sense.
Yeah,
Right.
so like if you're someone who studies a lot of Euclidean geometry and you have a love for it, right? I think that they are very aware of our emotional connections to the things that we have love for. That they, that those are the formats or visions that they try to share with us as the way they would look to us, because they want to be loved and accepted within us or outside of us. Paradoxically, it's probably both.
Right.
But that, yes, I think that that's why people have such different experiences of these entities, and yet many of them may in fact be the same type of entity. They could be the omnipresent one entity. That there's context within that even of what logos is, as from a pantheonic sense, that there was the all God that was the total mind of the archetypes, and then there were these more individual deities or archetypes that express themselves as metaphors of the human psyche. But always these entities are looking for some format of a personification that feels comfortable and like something that you love to connect with.
Right. Now, before we go on, I did want to ask, have you heard of, by chance, the Owl of Minerva, From Dusk Till Dawn?
Well, I know lots about Minerva and the owl and the Athenian archetype, because I lived it for a long time. Happy to have evolved away from it, but I don't know specifically to the context you're speaking of.
Okay, can I get your overall perspective, if that's all right, on the Owl and Minerva, and why you truly, just asking good faith, why you feel comfortable moving away from it rather than leaning into it per se?
Well, so it's sort of Minerva or Athena are a pretty incongruent archetype. So they supposedly born from their father's mind, right? Not born of anything materia necessarily, but there's a lot of context to the sort of relationships of how that particular archetype treated other women, other forms of femininity that I don't speak to anymore, that was highly competitive, highly envious, highly projective. Most people don't know that the story of Medusa, most people hear about Medusa and they associate Medusa as the bad guy. But the origin of Medusa is that she was a young woman, human woman, who was very beautiful, so beautiful, in fact, that there were men who near Athena's Acropolis would speak to her beauty and the potential of her being more beautiful than Athena or Minerva.
That's the duality of, we have to label something negative.
Well, right. So anyway, basically the other thing that happened is that Neptune raped Medusa. And she ran to Athena's Acropolis, basically or Minerva's Acropolis, to ask her for help, for protection. And because of Minerva's envy of these comments of Medusa's beauty, she actually chose to punish her and turn her into a Gorgon. And like there's context to her actually even stating that she defiled the Acropolis by coming there. So, it's just, there's a lot of deeper mythology. I think people know some very basic mythology, especially when it comes to Greek and Roman. I know from my study of it, it's probably my least favorite of the pantheons that I've experienced, because there was a lot of power given to pretty awful masculine archetypes. And also pretty toxic feminine archetypes. Like even the Juno archetype is one that's pretty toxic and envious of other women, and that doesn't place much conscious responsibility on the masculine or patriarchal archetype that it is sort of contractually obligated to within the mythology.
Which, right now, which archetype would you say you are, forgive me if this isn't the best way of putting it, but ideologically subscribed to at the moment, that you lean into the most, that you would recommend to others to delve into in a more good faith, open conjecture setting of approach?
Oh, it's a personal experience, honestly. I am at a point where I'm happy that those mythologies existed. I've created my own in my own mind,
Right.
from the basis of the origins of the archetypes as expressions versus personifications. I think that the archetypes have been way over personified over the history of humanity, and that people have a tendency to then sort of idolatrize those patterns or behaviors instead of creating new ones. That they have a tendency to repeat them instead of understanding that they are their own archetypal new expression to become anew. We can kind of get over obsessed with wanting to be a pre-existing mythological archetype instead of self-actualizing as archetypally new, different self.
Sorry, Mira, when you say the tendency to repeat, does that speak to, and I'm not asking this in a negative nor positive manner, just right down the middle, does that speak to fractals or cymatics, or would you view that in a bit of a different category, if you will? Because I wonder how, forgive me, for both as much good as there could be to go down these rabbit holes that I go down myself quite often, there seems to be, myself personally, I find myself going down these rabbit holes that sadly bring me back to an archetype that I'm not particularly a fan of. Maybe that's just me in my mind, but do you see what I'm saying?
Yes. So I accepted that I existed in that more Minerva or Athenian nature, but that it also feels like an expression of mythology that was written by men for men. That basically it took the feminine and removed, there was also a very different context of the feminine archetype that was less individuated at one point in, very early Roman pantheons that actually understood Minerva, Venus, and I think Juno as actually one expressive deity, that they were, that all of the archetypes were one woman or one feminine deity that had these different expressions available through her. And so that's the thing that I connected to most, that sort of was a revelation for me of that whole shapeshifter concept of, oh, well, we are all of the archetypes, that we breathe and exist in all of these many different emotional expressions. Why do we have this tendency to want to pick a favorite and box ourselves into that storyline, or think that that has to be, why go backward in time? Why not make a new evolved expression of the feminine and the masculine that has an understanding and acceptance of those truths as a part of our human history, but also has an understanding that, they're the past for a reason, that, you're intended to learn from it, but not repeat it. And like I said, I think people get a little idolatrous about those really personified deities, where they don't see it as a simile or expression of the psyche and how to get out of those patterns, instead of how to look at them as some bigger force or thing that's greater or better than you, just because it was written into mythology as a god, basically.
Right. Now, I did want to ask about this, if I may, this archetypal wheel that we had brought up prior to recording that you had mentioned. But before I bring that up, I did want to ask your perspective, whether from someone who studies these pantheon of archetypal foundations and superstructures, if you will, and also as an integrative therapist, what do you, if you've come across this before, and if not, I'd love to get your initial reaction in real time, but there have been many hypnotists where they've taken particularly children that have gone through hypnotic regression and things like this, and again, presuming under the facet of multiple filters and all of that, nothing is I guess you could say faked or anything like that, and a handful of children seem to have the same past life memories amongst a handful of them, almost as if, again, forgive me for oversimplifying more so to the audience, but the shell of the body was sort of copy and pasted onto multiple variations of a, dare I say, spliced soul, if you will, or something like this. Now, I'm using overly generalized words just to get to the point, but have you come across this? And if so, what does that speak to you as?
So I think it's the fractal nature of consciousness, basically. You know, when you look at something like a fern, which is one of my more favorite expressions of fractal geometry in nature for a multitude of reasons. One, because it's so old. It's one of the oldest ones on the planet, and clearly doing pretty well from an evolutionary standpoint because it hasn't had to change itself very much. But one of the things about the ferns, when you look at it, is that a fern is made up of a bunch of other little ferns, basically. That, you know, when you look at a feather is made up of a bunch of other little feathers. And so it comes back to me for the concept of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. And yet there has to be a set of parts for there to be a sum.
Which speaks to that sort of that I guess you could say cosmological feedback system of a fractal toroid field or something like this of the cycle with one is needed for the other. Now,
1,000%.
Would you say that concept could be situated within the archetypes itself, or there would need to be one archetype as a whole and a second one to comprise that sense of duality?
So I think we're born with well, we spoke to this last show too, that there's like, you know, we're born with a sensation of free will, but that we maybe, you know, from a percentage standpoint, we aren't maybe existing or expressing in the totality of our free will because of some of the, you know, genetic codex programmatic structures we're born with. One of those things being our zodiacal expression from an exterior standpoint. So we kind of spoke to this before the show, but that whole context of this is my sun sign. And so these are my behavior patterns. These are my traits. And I, you know, even if you aren't someone who follows zodiac or astrology, that I think there's a lot of truth to some of those expressions up to and until the point that you decide to redefine yourself to self-actualize. But that until you have the awareness from your sort of learning experience within the less free-willed archetypal programming, like the zodiac sign, that you can't get, you have to have that space to get to the space where you can self-actualize. You have to be unself-actualized to be able to move to self-actualization, which is a pretty, you know, metaphorically accurate description to even what we were speaking about earlier, as far as God being and not being, and that I am that I amness. Right? Like at some point, consciousness, or, you know, whatever the origin or root of all reality is, had to ask the question or think or have a sensation of what am I? And so that's sort of, for me, the same, that's what spiritual awakening is for a lot of people, is what am I, what am I not, and what do I want to be, are kind of like those three questions that have to be asked, but that you only start asking those if the existing archetypal programming feels like it's not working for you, or that it's something you have to break away from so that you can continue to become you in a different, you know, a slightly different variation.
So let me ask you this. Why do the gods have such human flaws? You know, I know that there's a reason for it. It seems like, and this is an issue I had in religion as well, it seems like I'd like outgrown that type of behavior, you know, from the god I was supposed to worship, kind of a thing, you know what I mean? And so with all these jealous gods and all of that kind of stuff, it's interesting that it seems like the strongest and most powerful methods of control only go up to a certain reading level, if that makes sense. It seems like once you get past the 8th grade, you don't really feel like reading Goosebumps books anymore. You know what I mean? And so it seems like these archetypes don't resonate with you anymore because you've kind of outgrown them, even ideologically. You're just like, okay, well, I mean, it's kind of a cool story and it's cool that they can like lift shit with their mind and stuff, but I would never be that jealous, or I don't, you know, empathize with the weaknesses that they have. I may have my own, but even it seems like this all-powerful thing that has those specific weaknesses that you've already outgrown. Like I said, it's like a reading level thing. It seems to only appeal to people at that certain level of awareness, and then that's when it breaks down, you know, as far as being practical in your life at that point. Is that something that you empathize with?
Yeah. So, you know, I've thought about this a lot, like even the fact that whatever the totality of creation is has to have had an egoic moment for us to have ego.
Yeah.
Right. And so that egoic moment for me as an expression is a lot of those more original formats of mythology, because the, you know, Yahweh or Elohim, really more so Elohim, is a highly egoic, mindfully incongruent being, because we as human beings were being that. And so we sort of like didn't want to take conscious responsibility for it and made it a man in the sky.
Right.
Right. but that, you know, we at a certain point now we're like ready to return to source, but not ready to face all that source has been, because it's all that we have been. And so it's like our more human nature within God that makes us, you know, that disconnects us. I saw a great post the other day about someone who basically was talking about how so many people, you know, define enlightenment as an inhuman experience, and that makes it, you know, entirely intangible or approachable for us as human beings, and that it's also just unrealistic. That, you know, if you look at some of the people who have accepted as enlightened beings, they had very human qualities. They also potentially had, you know, from a psychology standpoint, pretty narcissistic qualities. Like Christ walked around walking around saying that he was the Son of God, and everyone was like, okay. But you have to be, you know, I don't necessarily think it's egoic in the sense of, you know, I think that there's a difference between being centered within yourself and being self-centered. For me, that expression was something that was centered within self, but not necessarily self-centered. That the opposite end of that spectrum, though, would be that self-centeredness, that selfishness that has, you know, just like the man in the sky is separates itself from the rest of humanity and puts itself above instead of seeing itself in all things. That would be that more like Christ I amness, that, you know, sees itself in everything else.
Have you heard of to everything you just said? Thank you so very much. If it seemed like I wasn't paying attention, it's because I was trying to pull up a bunch of papers pertaining to what you were saying.
No, I'm that person too. You're fine.
Thank you. Have you heard of, to everything you just said, something called evolutionary code theory by chance?
I'm sure that I have come across it, but not necessarily in like with that titleage, if that makes sense.
Sure. If I could read here for yourself and the audience, is speaking to evolutionary programming is one of the 4 major evolutionary algorithm paradigms. It is similar to genetic programming, but the structure of the program is to be optimized is fixed, while its numerical parameters are allowed to evolve. So particularly the latter part there, while its numerical parameters are allowed to evolve, I couldn't help but think of your proposal on fractals, which seems to be that same concept there. But not only that, do you find, Mira, pertaining to the first sentence, I'll read it one more time. Evolutionary programming is one of the 4 major evolutionary algorithm paradigms. Notice how, again, it speaks to 4, the number, the quadratics, the 4 vertices, the platonic solids of the cube, and, you know, squaring the circle, as they call it, and what have you. Do you find in any of the archetypes that you've delved into, whether you more so the ones that you tend to find more conjecture in and things that make more sense in that matter, do you find the platonic solids to be a reemergence, maybe not directly or explicitly, but a reemergence of 3 vortices that could comprise a triangle, you know, 4 vortices that could comprise a cube, so on and so forth?
So what's interesting about this is that if you take DNA and splice it and look down at it from a top view, it basically looks like the Trinity. Or which ironically enough actually is not devoid of that 4th element. It's the thing that encapsulates it, right? But everyone sees the 3 fish or the 3 you know, sort of vertices and goes, oh, the Trinity, it's 3. Well, realistically it's 5, because it is that exterior circle also, but then it is also the thing that is all of it all at once, which people kind of forget about. But to that effect, I actually, if you don't mind,
please,
me sharing my screen, I have this, I have a thing that I put together that involves that. Let me see. Of course, it'd be helpful if I knew how to like share my screen.
No worries. It's the
Okay, there it is.
Yeah.
So, all right. So, oops, I'm sharing my workshop. But so this is a symbol that I took the Trinity, and I basically noticed that the teal is another addition, which is basically that nothing that exists as the space for the Trinity, or this sort of symbol to exist within at all. But that I kind of looked at it as a flow, and I labeled the flow of it as consciousness. and that from our perspective, it's sort of, there's past, present, and future. And then from that more synchronistic awareness or total awareness of time, there's the transcendent self, which perceives, kind of the fullness of its experience through time in a simultaneous and present fashion. So it's like, when you are going through life and you realize like, wow, this same thing happened exactly a year ago. Maybe it was like slightly different, right? But that's that sort of archetypally expressed self that's moving out of that 3D structure, that more linear structure, that more flat structure or understanding of time and consciousness into this space. What's interesting too, there's a facility near me called Genalia, and they are actually studying 4D cellular structure right now, that it's possible for us to, from a neuroplastic standpoint, our DNA seems to be very Trinitarian, but we seem to be consciously evolving it into a more quaternitarian format of even DNA. But it kind of plays into that concept of repeating the existing codex versus self-actualization. The self-actualization that's occurring right now seems to be the thing that's neuroplastically and consciously evolving us into that 4D cellular structure as entities versus, staying within that Trinitarian one that is, sort of the more orthodox concept.
Sorry, Mira, I'm sorry to jump. Would that speak to randomness versus indeterminism or non-determinism? Because randomness would be that you have a preset pantheon of outcomes that have to be sort of inserted beforehand in order for them to be built upon by the task maker, whereas non or indeterminism is something that seems to be something that Sir Roger Penrose claims, admittedly, that he can't describe what it is, but he can certainly describe what claims it is not, if that makes sense.
Well, it must be very godlike then if you can't put it into words.
It's
the thing I would say about that. But yes, I think that there is a bit of like effect in that sense too, where we're so obsessed with consciously linguistically assigning identifiable consensus value to things that oftentimes some of the greatest minds in the world have difficulty putting these things into words because it is so intangible. But that whole, that's a pretty fractal thing too, in the sense that it's more concerned with the anomaly behavior within creation than it is concerned with the determined or orderous behavior. But to equate it, to something that we oftentimes want to put ourselves above, or as society, is that even when you look at computational systems, let's say the three of us all buy the same, laptop at the store.
Sure.
And they all have the same operating system, but they all also have a learning algorithm that comes with the operating system. Those three computers are going to learn and experience very different things because of their experience of us as the architect of their learning, right? But they don't have much free will within that learning process. And yet it can come to a point where if you let those three operating systems and learning algorithms speak to each other, they'd go, well, wait, I'm different than you, and yet we're the same. How is that possible?
Because there was a preset by, for example, when I purchased my computer, took it home, I preset it with tasks that were accustomed to my individual self. And you did the same thing, and Brandon did the same thing.
Right.
Right.
So, there's even a space there where those learning algorithms would learn that there are other learning algorithms that learn differently. Right. And then there would be, even in that space, there would be a possibility or sensation for that effect of I am. Now, because I am different.
Right. Now, going back to the concept of the building upon a genetic paradigm or code that's already there, I wonder if that example of us taking the computer, bringing it home and all of that speaks or parallels to that, because of the fact that, say, in this metaphorical example, we needed to deliberately turn the computer on and conduct a set of tasks in order for that computer to even begin to learn, if that makes sense. There was an activation.
And what's even more interesting about this, when you put this idea over this reality, is that we're all computers that all have already had a bunch of programming in the forms of past lives, that we come into an experience together to learn with each other on how we each other learn with what we're presented in this place. But it's from a knowledge base of a learning algorithm that we've added to over however many lifetimes or soul expressions or whatever we even wanted to add to this. Maybe you
That's
left half of your deck of experiences back in the other reality and you only needed this certain set, for here. And so you come in with this preloaded computer and then you learn a bunch of more shit here too.
Well, to me, that speaks to ancestral DNA and the
Yeah, exactly.
fractalization, the
Exactly.
fractalization of it. The thing, not to get all tinfoil hat here, but the thing that is claimed in the surface level academics is junk DNA, I think is really not.
Ooh.
What's that
Let's
culture?
let's talk about junk and all of the archetypal similes that express itself even within a computer, because we gave a computer a subconscious mind and we call it a RAM drive. Do you know what the job of a RAM drive is? To take junk data or extraneous data and hold it until there is an opportunistic moment from the learning experience of the more conscious hard drive of the computer to re-inject it into the system in the right moment, because now all of a sudden it's useful. But before that, the reason it existed in the RAM drive as junk data was because there hadn't been something that had happened yet on the conscious part of the hard drive to make it useful.
Like a conductor with a coil.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and what's interesting is that we call it the RAM drive, right? So even the word RAM has all sorts of symbolic context to it, in the sense that the ram horns have been something that has always been symbolically representative of fertility, and very specifically the womb. Yep. And again, that intuitive subconscious connotation of it as, being the subconscious mind of a computer, for example, versus the conscious mind that is, that hard drive, that interface that we sort of and play with. But yeah, it's just sort of fascinating.
Not just because you're here, Mira, but if I could say, I truly do believe that the feminine energy, the divine feminine, the archetype of that is substantially stronger than that of the male. And it's not about competition, but I say this because based on my own personal research, there seems to have very sadly been a suppression of the divine feministic, source of energy or anything of this, if you will, because I mean, if we think about the concept of, our internal compass is constantly, from an ontological perspective, being swayed, whether it's through advertisements or what have you, external environmental, influences and all of that. I find it quite interesting that when we look at the fact that, again, going back to the limitation of language, particularly deriving from the Anglo-Saxon influence of Latin and all of that, we find that truly, based on certain scientific experiments, women are substantially more powerful than men pertaining to, and I'm not saying this because you're here, it's just this is what I found.
I think I agree with you. I think the difference is that the feminine archetypal expression of creation has never been interested in defining itself as powerful, because it's highly dualistic and competitive, and that's not where the archetypal feminine strength lies. This is another reason why the Athena archetype was one I kind of moved away from, because it felt like one that was far more interested in expressing itself as toxic masculinity to fit the existing pantheonic structure as powerful, instead of existing as its more archetypal original form of the feminine expressiveness that is, that its strength is held in its emotional awareness and its ability to, let things go, for example, or its ability to speak up for itself without being competitive about it. That it can see something that's being unloving and still be loving, but that this is a very different form of strength than these more conscious patriarchal, sort of masculine energy was interested in for a long time, because for a long time Darwinianism told us that evolution was done by competition, not by nurturing. And yet when we look at it from a more realistic perspective, from a more macro perspective, we see that it's always been nurturing. It's just been our perception of suffering through competition and duality that's, made it seem that way.
I wonder if the archetypes, speaking to the fractality of the micro versus the macro, I wonder if certain archetypes are exclusive to a particular, I don't want to say plane, I don't want to say realm, I feel like that's too limiting, but you see what I'm saying? I wonder if there's an exclusive plane that may be suited, sort of like the way you lock a Matryoshka doll over top another, to a particular archetype, more so than that of another set of scalability.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. And this is a very silly example, but it's one that I'll give that I experienced the other day that was like very revelationary to me, which is that I was on a walk and I walked by a family of geese. So there were 2 adult geese and there were like 5 little baby geese. Now, one of them was like highly attentive, not eating, not being, and like looking around for danger. And I immediately thought to myself, like I had a paradoxical moment with it, where at first I wanted to define it as masculine. I wanted to say, oh, that must be the male goose. But then I sort of like started playing with it from a perspective standpoint, from that archetypal awareness standpoint, and was like, well, no, actually, usually it's the mother that's more attentive, that's paying more attention to the exterior world out of protection, and is sort of not really self-sacrificing, but choosing to not allow itself to be, mindlessly just eating with the children as though nothing else is happening around it. Right. And I realized that we've sort of flip-flopped that in society, where like the way I was raised, I immediately defined that one goose as the masculine, even though I haven't really gotten to know that expression of the masculine very much in my lifetime. And I don't think that very many people have, but that it also kind of really helped me open up to the understanding of how subjective even that is. That whole concept of I am that I am, and that, when you look at philosophical consciousness or spiritual consciousness from even a more Taoist or Eastern philosophy perspective, that consciousness within us is, total consciousness is both. And that you have to find those archetypal expressions within yourself and understand that sort of flip-flopping nature of them too, even through the evolutionary process that has allowed us to be, genetically or phenotypically man or woman, but still come to a more total understanding of the expression of gender through us, as us, in a bigger way. Speaking of like those patterns, as far as repeating them over and over again, I'm at a point now where I've realized, well, at some point along the way, there's got to be a new form of gender that comes along that's like, pretty realistic. Otherwise, gender sort of becomes devoid of meaning within the evolutionary process. So it'll either be that we lose gender as a construct because of how dualistic it is, or there will be new forms of gender that are created, consciously first, spiritually expressively first, but that then they would possibly appear in physical form. And we know this kind of already to be true, because there are people that are born as hermaphrodites. And that as a society, we look at that as a malfunction, but that from, a creative evolutionary standpoint, it really might not be.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because there was, and forgive me to the audience if this may not be the best example, but there's a show that I used to watch called House, the doctor based out of New Jersey. And there was one episode where he had some parents come in, and they were very frustrated. This was in the mid 2000s. This episode was filmed, as to whether or not their son or daughter was male or female. And he basically, by the end of the episode, bit of a spoiler here, again, was a hermaphrodite. And he said, generally speaking, he goes, in pure medical theory, I'm paraphrasing here, your son or daughter is the perfect male or female.
Right. Yet we look at that as anomaly as, diseased or incorrect.
Well, I wonder if that speaks to the dualistic archetype of, again, there needs to be that pillar of comparison, but why does the pillar of comparison even need to be negative to begin with? And then if you were to open up that set of more, I guess, Venn diagram circles, you then have a macro scale out of the flower of life, if you will. And then how do you compartmentalize, or from an entropic or negentropic state, how do you organize those, if at all?
Yes. Sorry, go ahead, Brendan.
Oh, I was just going to say that it's very interesting that we kind of experience this dualistic reality, this two genders, this or that, either or, this kind of concept. And so, yes, maybe mirror what you're talking about is the next evolution, which is the next concept of even that being null and void, meaning like we've done that, okay, that's cool, and then we're going to move on. And it even seems that maybe it's something to where it's like a combination lock, to where it takes like 4 different species to make a baby, out of the 22 that exist or something. And it'll take like a combination of them on a harvest moon or something, and it'll be this thing.
That's how the hermaphrodite happened.
Right. And that's the thing, right? It's like Baphomet, right? It's this androgyny. It's this idea that you're yes and no. It's this either or, but it's neither. So it's the opposite of either or. It's yes.
Well, pre-Orthodox scripture described creator as above or beyond. gender. So if
Right.
we have a society that's very obsessed with the idea of returning to source, where, well, then the direction we would probably be going in is to be devoid of our more highly egoic identifications of things like gender.
It's very interesting. And you say something like that, to the wrong crowd, right? We're all open-minded here, so we can talk about this kind of
Yeah.
stuff. But you say that
I'm
to
happy
somebody.
to be the sandpaper you can choose to polish
Well,
yourself
and
on.
that's what's interesting is this is a safe place, I mean, and so we can talk about stuff like this in a realistic format without ego, and that's what it comes down to. A response like the one that I'm talking about here is this egoic, like, hang on to this old way of doing things, and it's just like all the people nowadays that are screaming for the, getting things back to normal. Well, normal's gone. We've evolved
Was
past
not.
that.
Well, and that speaks to what I was going to ask Mira pertaining to should or could or would it be appropriate from an ontological or deontological perspective for ego ability to even be scaled? Is it again, just throwing ideas out, that the ego, not to say should, but through some type of archetype of whether it's genetic programming or whether it's through an evolutionary lens of sorts, should there be a ceiling, a metaphorical ceiling, that in that micro macro scalability be like, should ego hit the ceiling at some point, if that makes sense?
Guess which archetype is going to best serve you in that situation, ironically? The Minerva archetype, because what did she do? Broke through the ceiling of her father's mind. So, it's not, now there's just an evolved expression of that archetype. You just name the new ceiling, or, skull of the psyche of that other larger archetype,
Right.
but that it's always there to sort of that its
higher
role at a like very root level is to penetrate through those ceilings to
So
get.
you have a regurgitating archetype of just hitting a bigger ceiling, essentially.
Well, I think a new ocean. You're hitting the tension that exists between two realms, right? So we know this even to be true with the realms of water and air. So we view air as our realm, right? But to a fish, water is their realm. But there is a surface tension that must be broken, that must be penetrated through to go between those realms, basically.
That, oh my gosh, that resonates. Well, Brandon, you want to jump in, but that resonates to me, at least personally in physics, looking at a variety of squeeze states and a variety of different, I guess you could say, particle fluctuations within those squeeze states.
Please go on with that. I'll save mine. Go on with that.
Oh no, please. That's all I wanted to say. Please.
I had it and I lost it, so that's
no
okay.
worries. No worries.
I trust the power of your subconscious mind to bring it back to you.
I know. I know it'll come back, but no, this is just fascinating. I just love these deep dives, and I knew that you two would hit it off. I knew this.
It speaks to the whole concept of the observability in squeeze states, and that speaks to the whole angle of, I guess you could say, the expansion and compression of fractality and of one's perception. Go again, it's like a tensor method.
Breathing, yeah.
Of an elastic of breathing. Like when you hug somebody, you don't hug them like this, you hug them like this. Eventually you need to let go, or else you're going to physically squeeze them to death, literally. So it's that same, right? It's that same idea. That, okay, I just want to say, Mira, I want to thank you, because you actually opened my mind in terms of that, particularly to the ego being scaled. Because if you were to stop it at one point, there's still that larger scale in which it's going to reside, because it's part of the archetypal foundation in and of itself.
Yes. Yeah, okay. I think people, and even admittedly, even I did this, made an enemy of the ego, right? Because even as I was emerging out of duality mindset, I had to have an enemy to be against to feel like I was getting somewhere. But that I've realized now that I can actually exist. For me, it's looking at it from the concept of, how can I use words to define my ego in a way that allows it the most fluid experience? So that's where that whole I am thing came in, because that's really the only deep defining sustainable identity that I have applied to it at this point, so that I don't attach too much of a limiting self-worth to particular titleages in my lifetime. And so, this kind of speaks to that in general, but I think something you might find interesting, even as we speak about the move from that Trinitarian concept to the Quaternion concept, is that more recently, and I've talked to Brandon about this before, that there's been a discovery that there's a fourth phase of water. And that, you know, previously we only thought there were 3 phases of water. Well, maybe there really were only 3, that we only were able to experience 3 phases of water up until the point that we discovered and or invented it. Who knows which actually happened. But the fascinating thing about, and so the 4th phase of water is referred to as the exclusionary zone. And basically how it acts within the phases of water is as a channel or as a squeezing. As you would describe it, acts as a tension that funnels, you know, so the example of this is that if you took a bendy straw, like a plastic straw, and you cut it and you put it in water, the exclusionary zone is what creates a flow or a channel that you can visibly see, that the water then picks a directional flow to move in. Whereas there are other forms of liquids that you can put that in, like oil, and there's no flow that happens. There's no channeling that happens.
When it picks a direction, regardless of the direction, does it seem to revolve or orbit, if you will, around that center point?
Yes, it's very convergent. You know, very like
a Tesla coil, like the
oh yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay. Wow. Sort of like a harmonic oscillator as well. I mean, we can keep going with the examples, but I don't mean to sort of be the party pooper of this, but in the next few minutes, I probably have to take off myself. But I was wondering, is there anything, Brandon or Mira, that either of you wanted to jump in on to sort of end off with, or?
I kind of remember what I was going to say. So I was curious about this, like, scalability of these archetypes, and that's something that's very interesting to me, because like whenever I think about this place or whatever, I think of like this dualistic nature, and I think duality only exists here because it's necessary here. But outside of that, like time, you know, we can already kind of wrap our minds around that. And so even the structures themselves, the archetypes and the things that we wish to be different, or the things that we feel like I said, like we've already outgrown this egoic, you know, whatever. And so it feels like that there should be, in my mind again, that this is sort of an isolated environment. Like it's just here. And so therefore the outside of that you have, yeah, there you go. And then outside of that, at some level, though, the ego is no more because it's not necessary. You see what I'm saying? Like, is there a level of existence where the ego and duality and all of that is not necessary anymore?
This speaks to the Cartesian plane, and yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
But more so non-Euclidean elements that seem to break out of that 3D linear cause and effect chronology.
Yeah, and we would call it like perfect, right? Because then you don't have too hot or too cold. It's just
Right.
like a state of existence that's perfect for you because it's just ideal. And so
Well,
you would call it perfection because you lose the things here that we find to be unperfect, which is this lack of balance and harmony and things like that. So the opposite of that would be balance and harmony. And maybe the ego is there, but it doesn't present itself as an ego because it's so well integrated as a part of a whole. So it's not separate. You know, like this is the example of like you hating your fingernails. You know what I mean? It's like they're part of you. And at some point, you know, maybe on some perceptive level, you realize that it's a non sequitur. It's just like, oh, what? This thing? Yeah, of course, it's part of me. Whatever. We've got other stuff we're talking about. You know what I mean?
I can't remember. It might be the Bhagavad Gita that speaks to the body of God as it actually correlates astrologically the archetypes as like body parts of God.
Yeah.
So I think like Taurus is like the left foot or something, and like, you know, that there's some expressiveness to that. But again, because of our hyper obsession with personifying deity as this, for our egoic attachment, or you know,
you're saying as personifying is like asymmetrical,
like
bipedal,
human, like bipedal, yeah.
Yes. So I think there's
white
some
male
importance in
specifically.
that, in the relationship, that we need to accept ourselves as source, or as creator, you know, as dweller and architect. But that, you know, from like, so to your point, Brandon, I sort of contracted or deconstructed the archetypes before I was able to expand. And so you look at this even from the concept of breathing, that, you know, to become a deeper breather, oftentimes you have to learn how to like not necessarily hold your breath longer, but you have to be able to experience a deeper sense of contraction within your lungs before you can have a more expansive sense of, like, you know, your lung capacity, basically.
Holy cow.
But by the way, your lungs are super fractal too, because they're made up of a bunch of other tiny lung sacs that make up your greater lungs. But that for me, I had to go, okay, well, what are these basic principles of, like, even, I don't know how well people can see the wheel, but I'll kind of zoom in on it.
I could see very well. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very, very.
You know, we see that there's, you know, here's the Euclidean expression. It's the numbers.
And
right?
they're at right angles too.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but then there's this, like, one of the practices that's in this workshop for me is how can you coalesce opposites, which technically would be a contraction, right? Because you're making things one again, but that you're also learning how to make things one again so that you can make things different again. So, like, you know, I invent and I create are, you know, Leo and Aquarius, or, you know, Uranus and the sun, which are very opposite things archetypally, but that there's, at one point you have to accept that that is actually totally one thing, that their opposition is what actually makes them whole and the same, not so different. You know, even like that 11 as an archetypal number for people who are into numerology, 11 is considered a master number, and 5 is considered the number that is sort of denoting of our more human nature. Even those are very opposite archetypes, even in the simple format of numbers, right? But that, you know, how can you, so part of one of my exercises with this is making statements that coalesce or make one statement out of I create and I invent, for example. So one of the examples of this, which I'll kind of zoom back out, is there's a couple ways you could do this with the archetypal wheel. One is that you could take astrological opposites and combine them. So combining I am, which is, you know, sort of that Martianite Aries fire archetype with its celestial opposite I love, Venus, Libra, air archetype. And that as a statement or a linguistic, you know, coalescing would be, I'm an embodiment of love, and therefore I love what I am. That you're making those archetypes one whole again in that understanding of it linguistically. But then you could also do it by looking at archetypal opposites that are elemental. So even though Leo and Cancer are right next to each other, they are technically archetypally opposite, because one is, you know, very feminine, the other is very masculine. One is fire, one is water, but that you can combine them, and that even realistically, there's an understanding that water and fire can be pretty similar. So the statement that I made for this was, I am nurturing to my creations, and therefore I'm nurtured by creation. That there's like a paradoxical understanding of making those two things whole again. But one of my revelations for this was that one day I was sitting next to a river, and the way that the light basically reflected off of the water onto a piece of wood, it made it look like fire on the wood. And it was just like this extremely deeply resonant moment for me, where I was like, how fascinating that the reflection of water literally looks like flame. There's got to be a convergent, you know, connective relationship between those two things.
I want to thank you, Mira, because if you want to talk about synchronicities, the question I had, my final question, just to the both of you in general, actually had to do with precisely this. So regardless of where you put which signs on that wheel you try and align, to me, that speaks to, again, that concept of compression, but more so non-destructive compression. Yeah. That seems to be, again, going through that vortex, that spiral, that cone of what's many refer to as non-destructive self-implosion, charge collapse, or whatever you want to call it. Now, to me, this also speaks to what's been coined as 0-point energy, where no matter what you shrink in the, you know, from a thermodynamic sense or in other regards, in the room, in whatever room that you're conducting this experiment in, there is a fundamental force that remains at the center point of that conversion. And I wonder if, again, if such, maybe I'm being overly vague here, but if such ideal archetypes reside at that 0 point, and when pursued, it speaks to the micro and the macro of, you know, zooming in, zooming out, that whole angle there.
Yeah. So I have an interesting relationship with the number 0 because I kind of feel like, again, paradox in place, that 0 and infinity are actually the same number with just dualistic expression to them. Because what happens if you take the two ends of a 0 and twist it? You get an infinity, right? You get that convergent point. But that's that sort of looking in the mirror that has to happen for us. That's so archetypally representative of what it would mean then to be willing to face yourself in the concept of infinity, that twisting upon itself, that looking within, that intentional deconstruction, right? Like I do this with clients a lot too, where I'm always like, people find walls within themselves and they want to like blow them up and get rid of them. And I'm like, no. There's lots of useful material here. We could like take all the bricks out and make a bridge now with them. Like, let's not just pulverize everything.
To me, that speaks to the relationship of realigning. Instead of cause and effect, people think, okay, it has to be this way. So if it's not this way, I'm throwing it out. Who's to say? There could be a realignment or a reshaping of those observables in an archetypal sense that you can then manifest into your day-to-day life to then improve your life.
Yes. So, I think, from the context of 0 point, I think that, we're looking at it as 0 point because that's our human perception of it, but that realistically it's the point of the infinitous moment happening all at once. It's just that would feel like nothing to us because it's devoid of a lot of the more human characteristics that are, highly emotive and reactionary to stimuli, but that, creation as a whole doesn't really react much to stimuli, because if it did, then it would be too controlling over the creative process instead of letting it just happen.
And
hopefully that kind of makes sense.
Absolutely. That speaks to a potential interference of the process of assembly of fractalization or defractalization. So that would be sort of an interruption in Mother Nature or the cosmos or whatever the underlying blueprint is comprised of.
Yes.
Right.
Even in fractals, there's got to be a moment where it decides to be nothing to be something new again.
Oh, because it's never ending. So it has to end itself.
Right.
And that takes a conscious decision. Something I was just going to say to wrap this up, and then, but this has been amazing. I knew, again, you two would hit it off.
Yeah, thank you very much.
No, thank you.
This might be a whole new thing here. We'll talk about it. But anyway, so one thing I was thinking about this is how interesting it is that we are on this on the level of scale of perception that we're on. And here's what I mean by that. If we zoom in far enough, it's just a bunch of the same things, or potentiality. If we zoom out far enough, all of the concepts of individuality and self and experience all dissolve, and they're just gone. It's just like whenever you go on the internet or something and you find on a picture and you zoom into it super far to like a period on the chart that you had, and you think that that's reality, but really it's just this one little piece of a huge picture. And then if you zoom out super far, now it's a small little period looking dot, but in that period looking dot, that far zoomed out encompasses that whole presentation that you had. So there's a lot at whatever scale, but we seem to be right at the scale of experience, which is really cool. So we're like fortunate to be at this scale. So I just kind of want people out there to kind of think about that as you're going through your day. Like, no matter what it is, if it sucks, then you still have the eyes to perceive it that it sucks. And that's a beautiful gift in this model.
We're all collectively learning from that. Thank you.
I truly couldn't agree more. And with that said, if it's all right for the both of you, Mira, could you please tell everyone on my end of things where and how you could be found? If there's any work you'd like to promote of your own, I'd be more than happy to help promote it.
Sure. So I have a website, www.moonandrune.com, and that is for my integrative wellness practice as a therapist. There's all sorts of stuff you can read about how I approach psychology and spirituality as healing modalities in session, and sort of the more individual work that's available to people in that sense. But there's also a self-discovery section that I invite everyone to look at, because there are all sorts of things that I've written from a sort of more biopic, individual I am sense of consciousness and what happened for me through sort of my spiritual awareness and awakening. But then there's also been a lot of stuff that I've shared to it that have been a part of that revelationary process that, are old understandings or philosophies that, you know, I hope that people will just check it out. There's a reason I call it self-discovery, because I don't want anyone to feel the context of what it meant to me, except for in particular areas where I've found it to be pretty true for most of the people that I've dealt with. And so those are those more biopic writings. But please check it out. And then you can find me on social media on Instagram at Mira Taylor Wellness is my personal account. And then I have my business account, which is at Moon and Rune Wellness.
And Brandon, of course, as usual, brother.
expandingrealitypodcast.com. Thank you guys so much. That'll get you everywhere else.
Awesome. And very quickly, just for Brandon's audience, patreon.com/Generation Z, Generation Z podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, or YouTube, at Podcast Z on Twitter. And I believe, Generation Z podcast, no space, no capitals, on Instagram. Thank you so very much, especially to Tamira for coming on. This has been great, truly.
Absolute honor. Very happy to be here and grateful for it.